Hello there, and welcome to The Value of Everything. On this podcast show, we cover a number of issues relating to the role of journalism. I have Nathan Dickey, who is a freelance journalist and writer of a fairly extensive blog, nathandickey.wordpress.com. Hope you enjoy the show. You have a excellent blog, I must say. It's very extensive. You must be taking a lot of time because I think you must have written about 5 novels so far on that.
I enjoy writing a lot, and when I get good feedback, that's just a bonus.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I believe that you're fairly qualified in the realms of journalism. One of the podcasts that I released probably about 6 months ago, maybe a little bit shorter than that, it was about journalism in general and where the future was going to go for journalism. I just wanted to get your theories on that because we do have a lot of things which are coming into the mix right now where there's false narratives, there's alternative media, and really when it comes to finding the truth and what actually real good journalists are meant to do never seems to materialize. So I just wanted to just see where your thoughts were.
It'll be interesting to see where journalism heads in the future. It's very unpredictable because even 50 years ago during the Vietnam War, with all the film reels being shipped over to the US, at that time nobody would have guessed that now we can send that information instantly.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a good side to that. The advance of technology is spurring the spread of information faster, making average people more aware of what's going on at a faster rate.
Yeah.
And there's also some unintended downfalls or con sides to that, where the proliferation of information makes it harder to find real quality information that you have to pick out from all the junk.
Yeah, I think there's a problem where people can't delineate the information from what's fact from fiction and what is the actual ulterior motive from a newscaster. Now, would you say the majority of the US population would understand that, say for example, the Fox News is leaning to the right wing and they've got vested interests to put out that kind of news in that direction? Would you say that the majority of Americans know that, or do you think they just switch on the TV and they go, oh, this is a guy with an opinion?
When you ask academics and the people who understand how the media works, they'll obviously tell you that they're definitely right-leaning and they're slanted. But it's hard to say whether the average American who watches and adheres to Fox News understands that.
Yeah.
I'm sure most of them are aware that it is a right-leaning show. But your average adherent to Fox News would say, yes, they lean to the right and they're slanted, but they're also correct.
Yeah.
They would say something like that.
I don't know how you would go through reading the newspapers, but when I try and seek the information, I try and get the two sides. So there's usually a polar opposite opinion from one side to the other. So say if it's a war, you might try and read something from one nation's newspaper to another nation.
Mm-hmm.
You try and separate fact from fiction, and then you may get some kind of clarity about what's going on. I find it's always useful just to pick up different alternative media sources, and that's where I stand right now. Maybe occasionally in the past there might have been a few journalists that I liked, maybe like your Christopher Hitchens, he's gone now.
Mm-hmm.
You may have just sort of think, okay, well this guy, he's put his neck on the line a few times. I'm willing to trust where he's going with this. But there's not many journalists that are doing that nowadays. There's not really like these big ones, other than these alternative right media kind of journalists that you find, and maybe occasionally left wing, but I can't even think of any big hitters at the moment.
Investigative journalism, which is what I'm mainly interested in, is going through a hard time right now. There aren't a lot of investigative journalists. A lot of newspapers aren't setting aside a budget to have an investigative journalist department. And that's a problem, I think, because investigative journalism is really the lighthouse of journalism. It's where all the important work is being done, or should be being done.
Yeah. We're in this world of hyperconnectivity. Everything has to be instant. So it's instant gratification. You've got to have clickbait and look what this celebrity's doing right now. And it's just this quick wham bam, like here's the information all on a plate. And there isn't anything that caters for somebody that says, right, I've got this big pool of information. I'm going to start to divulge it and you're going to read through it. and then here's my conclusions, and then I'll leave it a little bit open so you can make some choices at the end as well. That thing doesn't exist really, does it?
Exactly. The clickbait culture is really killing the deliberate nature of investigative journalism that takes the time to do the research and weigh the evidence carefully and come to a conclusion that's backed by evidence.
Yeah.
And balance in journalism today means something now that it didn't mean in the past. You talked about looking for two sides to a story. One of the endemic problems in journalism today is the false balance.
Yeah.
Balance, as it was used in the past, once meant presenting two or more sides of a story as a set of scales, not presenting two sides as equal. So, with the scales metaphor, it's the weight of reporting being devoted to the side that carries the weight of the evidence. What journalists should not be doing is what is all too common and prevalent in the field today, and that is they artificially push down on the scales to force an equilibrium that does not exist in the real world.
Ah, yeah.
And we see this false balance in the debates over creationism and evolution in the popular media, or the debates over climate change, or when a prominent scientist such as Peter Duesberg claims that HIV doesn't cause AIDS, and other scientists, the overwhelming consensus in the community of scientists disagrees with him and says the evidence shows that that's just wrong. You'll read an article about it and they'll put the HIV/AIDS deniers' claims right next to the scientific consensus, and readers will get an impression that the two sides have equal merit.
That's a very good point you made there. I probably haven't really thought about that myself, and where I just mentioned about looking at the two sides, you could probably even say that I'm at fault myself with thinking that way because,
Well, what you mentioned, like when there's a war, it is a good idea to have a diverse set of viewpoints, not just
sure,
one nation. That's a little bit different.
yeah, but I think I'm definitely probably have been susceptible to just saying, okay, right, let's just listen to both sides and then try and work it out. But there's going to be one side that's going to definitely be tiptoeing into a lot of false claims, and then there's going to be one side that's going to try and stick to the truth.
I don't know if over there in Australia, creationism is probably not as big of an issue as it is here in the
No,
States. But here in the States, for example, when a scientist or a paleontologist, biologist, whatever, comes up with a discovery, like finding a new fossil or finding a new genetic sequence that contributes to the evidence for evolution, when the media reports on that, a lot of them feel the need to bring in a creationist to challenge the finding. And that's why the average American today who is not scientifically literate and reads that, when you ask them what's the evidence for evolution, they will say something like, well, it's just a theory, and they won't understand what the term theory means in science.
yeah,
They'll take it to mean in the colloquial sense that it's just a guess, and they'll say there's still a controversy over it when there really isn't.
that's really interesting. So where there's like a gulf of good journalists who can give the mainstream narrative, and the mainstream narrative should really always be trying to guide through the evidence and the truth. That seems to have evaporated. And then we have this two different situations, almost like a bipolar sort of personality of different thoughts. You give them so much gravitas, even the ones that are a bit more crazy, and that becomes the mainstream. And if you could say that this kind of gulf of good journalism that's in the mainstream starts to disappear, this gives more of a push for the dangers in society to happen. So, where you would say that extremism for a political stance. So you could have an extremely violent political stance that might be racist and things like that could come into the fray
Mm-hmm.
and could make some comments. There's different things that can happen here, which is very dangerous. One of the things that I mentioned with my podcast is about the profit motive straight away with journalism.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to get paid, haven't you, really? And there's advertisements and there's the readership. Now, the readership, in one degree, wants to hear certain things in a certain way, and they don't want to be told this other thing that might feel uncomfortable for them.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes a journalist has to be put in this really bad position where they say, look, I'm going to give you some news that you won't enjoy, and I'm going to lose my readership because of this. So it's a really tough game sometimes in journalism. And obviously, there's a hierarchy structure where you're a journalist, you've got a manager above you, and they've got a family and all that kind of stuff. They can't have the profit margins going to the wayside just because you're going on this crusade by yourself. It's a really difficult scenario.
Right, that is a problem. That's probably one of the reasons why investigative journalism is not very common today. There's a few exceptions, like the Spotlight team at the Boston newspaper. But yeah, finding your audience and keeping an audience does have the potential to create problems for individuals who want to produce original content and not just the content that the paper or the institution they're working for wants them to write.
Yeah. So, what do you think about these journalists that will just tell the audience what they want to hear? I'll say the majority of the journalists are probably just trying to keep a lot of people happy at the same time nowadays. So they're trying to keep their management happy, they're trying to keep their readership happy. And then you'll find other journalists that come into the fray, like they're freelance journalists, so they don't have like the management structure above them who are trying to guide them in a certain direction. They purely just try and give a narrative to what their audience wants to hear. But then there's one step beyond that to say, where's those journalists that will just not listen to anyone around them and just take themselves to the actual truth itself? So I would say that the structure of journalism right now is all about what people want to hear.
Yeah, once you turn away from speaking truth to power, which is the primary function of journalism and always has been since its inception,
Yeah.
once you stop doing that and just kowtow or make appeals to what your audience wants to hear, you're no longer really a journalist, you're a pundit or public relations spokesperson.
Yes. It's a very sad state of the world, but I always like look back at history, and I know that you study a little bit of history as well. Would you say that there's a certain reflection to a point in time which we're like right now to somewhere in the past?
I would say that the late 19th century state of journalism is very similar to what it is today. The late 19th century, so 1880s to 1900, thereabouts, was the age of yellow journalism,
Right,
which was when newspapers started churning out sensationalistic, over the top tabloid stories and content
right.
to drive up attention to their medium and to drive up readership. That was like the clickbait of the day, was the yellow print, which was how yellow journalism got its name,
Yeah.
the bold-faced type.
What was like the state of the economy, right? Wasn't it like recession after recession or something around that time?
There were a lot of bank failures in that time period and a lot of stock market crashes and panics. There was one in 1853, another in 1873. In the 19th century, it seemed like the stock market crashes and the panics started happening at a rate of every 20 years or so.
Yeah.
And so that definitely contributed to it, I think.
I remember the old school way of journalism. When did that start to kick in, where people were these people that were just trying to seek out the truth? They were brave souls, brave journalists. When did that start to kick in?
Yes, those were the Muckrakers who started emerging during the Progressive era, which started in the 1890s and went on through the 1910s. The term muckraker is a reference to a character in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress.
Right.
He was the man with the muckrake who could only look downward and rejected the salvation offered to him. And instead, he continued to focus on raking the filth at his feet. And Theodore Roosevelt used the term to praise the journalists who were writing exposés of political institutions and leaders who were corrupt and exposing the ills of society.
Yeah.
And the modern muckrakers are the investigative journalists. The term has come to be synonymous with watchdog journalism. In the Progressive era, you had Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. He revealed conditions in the U.S. cattle processing and meatpacking industry. There was Lincoln Steffens, who reported on the workings of corrupt political machines in several U.S. cities. There was Ida Tarbell, who wrote The Rise of the Standard Oil Company. She raised public awareness of the manipulation of trusts in the monopoly of Standard Oil.
Yeah.
And all those writers were responding to yellow journalism and trying to raise the standard of journalism in that time. Nowadays, there is a little bit of pushback, but not nearly the kind of pushback from quality investigators that you had back then.
It's true. Okay, I want to just get your opinion on the power side of journalism and the maybe it's the wrong term to use, but the propaganda side of things. So to change people's minds. So where would you say
Mhm.
that a journalist needs to be when they direct people information? Would you say that there's almost like an elite class of journalists who need to divulge this information, translate it, and then deliver it to the people because it's just too complicated for them to understand? Or is it almost like the journalist's role is to just educate the people so they can decide and they can make the choices in life?
I think the job of journalists is to educate the people. I don't think there needs to be an elite class of journalists, although I would say there needs to be a balance between what you were mentioning earlier about the independent
Sure.
journalists who are not attached to any institution and then the ones who answer to a hierarchy. There needs to be a balance between that because in the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a growing movement of citizen journalists
Right.
who have no training in the field and who ostensibly are presenting truth without any filter of any institution that they have to answer to. They're just going out and presenting information that they claim is accurate and has no prejudice or bias and
Yeah.
is not attached to any institution. That movement, I think, is actually harming the credibility of journalism. A lot of the so called citizen journalists are conspiracy theorists who, yeah, claim to be investigative journalists essentially.
With journalists, a lot of them go into politics and a lot of them become citizens of the people as well. What's your opinion of that? Like, it's almost like a journalist sometimes finds themselves into this very grey area between the people and the power, and yet they take both positions at the same time. And throughout history, there's loads of journalists that go into politics and they become very big, like Winston Churchill, for example. There's just literally hundreds of them in the past. It's a very interesting thing because they are the voice of the people, voice of the power as well. And then they assert themselves to a position of power eventually because of the masses that listen to them. Well, what I'm trying to say here is it's an incredible amount of responsibility and power once that journalist becomes quite established, isn't it?
There is a clear distinction between, at one point, you were a journalist representing the people and delivering information to the people, and then the transition to being a politician representing the people and no longer
Yeah,
essentially becoming his own subject. I think that's legitimate. Politicians who were once journalists, they're better able to turn the spotlight on themselves if they had experience in the past of
yeah,
putting the spotlight on other politicians and they have a better understanding of how the public perceives things because they were once intermediaries between
that's right. Yeah,
the political world and the public world.
yeah. They've got this incredible knack to empathize with the public, and then they can, well, you could say the word manipulate. It depends on under what certain circumstances that is. But they have this incredible power after that
Mm-hmm.
to talk to the masses, to capture them, and they know how people respond because they're used to the people listening to them. They usually are public speakers as well. And it's a very interesting twist. And obviously, everyone knows power corrupts everyone. So eventually, as this journalist gains more people and followers, the power that they have potentially turns them to corrupting themselves as well. I always find that the journalists probably that don't get quite corrupted are the ones that are, you could say, probably like arseholes. They don't make friends with anybody. They're just like, I'm going to go on my own way. The journalists that you probably have to be quite watchful of are the ones that you like, I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because the ones who are charismatic and likable are going to be the best at manipulating public opinion.
I find subjects of journalism fascinating. As soon as you just tap into journalism a tiny bit, you realise that it's like an immense subject that's got incredible amounts of power, corruption, the people, the like. It's immense. The actual subject itself, and as you start to tiptoe into it, you realise, oh my gosh, this is probably one of the most important subject areas that you could ever look into. You shouldn't walk into it just thinking that it's just like this silly little job that people have that's like almost like an artist job. It's really nothing to do with that. It's so much responsibility.
Oh, absolutely. Because journalism is both an art and a science. It actually straddles the
Yeah,
line between the humanities and the sciences because there is an art to it. It involves writing in such a way that will catch the reader's attention, which is a legitimate goal. The phrase today that's often used is if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah.
That's actually a legitimate style to use. On the other hand, there's a scientific aspect to journalism. It's a science because there are techniques involved and methods that have been tested throughout history. And the importance of journalism comes in when you realize that journalists are the historians of the present. Historians in later generations rely on the work of journalists to write history. And journalistic techniques were originally developed as a means of fact checking. There's a similarity to scientific research here.
Yes.
In science, you have replication, peer review. In the early years of journalism, the technique was developed to be just that.
Yeah.
You collect multiple sources to corroborate a story, for example. A scientist is essentially doing journalism when he or she recounts the details of an experiment in their paper. By contrast, a lot of journalism schools today teach that as a mantra, they teach there is no such thing as objective reality.
Yeah.
This creates the problem of false balance that we talked about earlier, and it undermines the primary function of journalism, which, as I said earlier, was its ability to speak truth and about power. What's doing the most damage to journalism's credibility today, where surveys asking people what careers or professions they distrust the most. This was the case 5 years ago, at least. I haven't looked at the figures today, but journalists rank number 3 in most distrusted professions after lawyers and politicians. And that's a consequence of the mantra that's being taught in most journalism schools today, that there's no such thing as objective reality.
Yeah. It's a sorry state of affairs, really, isn't it? You do get the impression that there are braver souls that are coming out there which have got a lot less to lose now, but then you do worry about the amount of power that they wield at the same time. They instantly kick up a storm, and then you always say that, like, if you have an immense amount of power in a very short space of time, you get this with like childhood stars that reach fame overnight, and they can't handle it. They end up turning into drugs and wasting themselves away. I guess you get an opposite with journalism, where they might hit this audience and then it's like, all right, okay, I'm going to take you on my little channel of thinking now. It's a little bit of a danger now. I always look at this repeat period of history. I feel like we're just at that 1939 situation where we're at a state of a very dangerous economic situation, and you've got the extreme left, the extreme right, who are gradually getting a lot more of the airways now, and it's a touchy subject that really just for these journalists to get involved. So I sit there and I look and I get a little bit concerned with the current state of affairs and where that potentially may lead us.
Yeah, the polarization of the media between far left and far right, that is largely a consequence of the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987. So the Fairness Doctrine was a formal policy of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. It was introduced in 1949, and it required public broadcasters to present programs on controversial issues of public import in a manner that the FCC deemed honest and balanced.
Yeah.
And one important effect of this system of regulations, and the Fairness Doctrine in particular, was to ensure that public broadcasting would be sensitive to critical feedback from both the public and from experts in science and politics or whatever else the program was covering.
Yeah.
The Fairness Doctrine was abolished by the FCC in 87 during Reagan's administration. Congress attempted to bring it back and codify it into law. Reagan vetoed it. This was like a watershed moment. This is when yellow journalism, the second wave, really began.
Yeah.
It spread into AM talk radio with people like Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah.
Him and his ilk were the main benefactors of the repeal of the doctrine because they could be loud, they could be angry, they could be opinionated.
Yeah.
And they had no burden to be sensitive to the critical feedback, the honest and balanced approach and investigative approach that characterized earlier programs. This led to what has been termed the opinion wars of the media.
Yeah.
Rush Limbaugh is one, Michael Savage is another, Bill O'Reilly, even somebody like Alex Jones.
Yeah.
is the legacy that the repeal of this doctrine has led to.
I think I've mentioned this before in previous shows. We don't get any idea of what a good debate is nowadays, do we? We always seem to find that, in my opinion, this is what a good debate is: just two people trying to cover the information, one side speaking their terms, one side speaking those terms, trying to seek the truth of the matter. Some person provides this evidence, some provides this counter evidence, and then tries to work a way of falsifying each other's claims until they find some point. Then there's a good moderator in between those people. Between the three of them, they seek the truth, and they're willing to accept. One of the more important things with a debate is to accept the other person's position and take them on that journey, and then say, well, but if we're going to go down this route, then there's this problem. And then the other person
Yep.
starts to go on the other side. We never get any kind of blueprint of that in the media. We never get, you could find it on YouTube maybe. You might be able to find some kind of debates in the Oxford auditorium or something like that. But beyond that, you very rarely see that. And obviously, even majority of debates do get this position of where there's a lot of people that are using what's the word? They're trying to use emotion to persuade rather than the actual trying to base it evidence, facts, trying to collate the information to get to that point. So society doesn't have any blueprint of what a good debate is, I find, and that's a problem. I know inevitably a lot of people are on egos. People don't like to be proven wrong. People just
Mhm.
will fight their corner. Things descend very quickly when there's a debate sometimes where it just becomes just ad hominems and you're stupid and that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Say, for example, I think we'll probably just segue into this a little bit, is where we have Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Looking at the debate there, literally just Donald Trump says, "You're wrong." That's it. That's the argument back in return. Everyone's just trying to throw little word bombs at each other, but there's nothing that's really hitting either side because nobody's actually entertaining the other person's position. The best form of defense is offense. So somebody will just fire a missile back at the other person. So that's the head of debate that we'll ever see. That's most people will ever see anyway. That's what people expect what a good debate is all about.
Yes, debate nowadays is basically nothing more than performance art.
Yeah.
And it wasn't always like that, I don't think. I haven't looked into the history of the debate. I'm sure there's a rich and fascinating history there. I think the devolvement of debate into its current state probably follows the same broad lines as the development of journalism has.
Yeah. That point, that sort of blueprint is gone, and I've made a case before that I know that there's debate things in college, but it really should be lesson number one. Even when you get two kids that have a fight in a school, it should just be a debate. We're not going to use violence here. Let's just get you two up there. Let's just see what both sides of you are. Like, tell me exactly what happened this morning. Okay, so who did what first? And then you stand them up and you let them talk about it. I think that's probably a better way of us going into that kind of direction rather than us just giving this narrative of he's mean and all this kind of stuff. This is what bleeds out, isn't it? This is the society that we're leading. And if it becomes a society of whoever's voice is the loudest is heard, then you have the problems of the great dictators coming into power.
You mentioned earlier about the importance in debate of entertaining the other person's position. And I think that's
Yeah.
one of the most important things that's missing is putting yourself in the other person's shoes. This is what I try to do when I read something I disagree with. I try to imagine that I'm making the argument.
Yeah.
That's the best way to understand where the other person is coming from without resorting to or falling for straw man arguments.
Yes, absolutely.
And trying to imagine yourself in the other person's position and trying to imagine that you're making the contrary argument that you're disagreeing with, that strengthens your own argument that you are making.
Yeah.
The Trump-Hillary debates and other political debates are, like I said, performance art. Because they don't do that, they become either shouting matches or people talking past each other.
Yeah.
Or both. And even in academic debates that are non-political, you see the same thing, people talking past each other. And that's not always the fault of the participants in the debate. A lot of times that's just a consequence of the way the structure is set up, where you have an opening statement from both sides, then you have a 20-minute response from one, 20-minute response from the other, 10-minute response, 10-minute response.
It's that speed thing, isn't it?
Yeah, the format that a lot of even academic debates follow isn't conducive to really getting at the truth and understanding the other's side.
Yeah, because everyone's really aware now that once you have a debate, you know that everything's going to be edited and it's all going to be sound bites. So everyone needs to get a very clear, concise message. Imagine if you just had a debate now where you had Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, got into a room at, I don't know, 10 in the morning, and they had to debate till 6 p.m. Maybe they had a little bit of lunch in the middle. So there's no moderator either. So literally they're just talking with each other and they have to go through a number of the subjects. They probably would start to get a little bit cold shoulderish with each other after a while, but it'll be interesting if you could see them relaxing and just talking about the subjects and seeing where that would go, because in the time frames that you have to respond to somebody and you know that you've got to hit them as hard as you possibly can, it creates a different format entirely. It's a Punch and Judy show. That's where you have puppets hit each other. Whereas in a format where there's time to go through things and explore, it's a different format entirely. But we get suckered into this.
Yeah, lots of other people have pointed out the same thing, the superiority of discussions versus debates.
Yeah. What I wanted to get is, do you have any certain political stances with the way that you look at journalism? Do you form any kind of position? Would you say that you believe in free markets? Do you believe that there should be a social structure in place for people? There's a bit of a game going on so that the people that can buy assets and purchase on top of that to get further. I know I've just sort of diverged a bit onto your opinion there. Sorry about that. But do you have a certain political position where you look at journalism, or do you just literally try and always look at things in a blank slate? And obviously, I'd like to just hear what your political opinion is as well on top of that.
When it comes to politics, I strive to be neutral to it when I'm writing a research essay or what have you.
Sure.
I have my own political views, although it's kind of hard to pin down. Broadly speaking, I'm left leaning liberal,
Yep.
but at the same time, I have certain positions, especially in regards to science, that places me at odds with my fellow liberals.
Yep.
I'm a proponent of nuclear energy, GMOs, vaccinations, and that puts me at odds with a lot of the frankly anti-science movements that are on the left.
You don't make many friends by saying that.
By saying what?
You like Monsanto and stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, Monsanto is they're an okay company. They're not nearly as demonic as so many people make them out to be. And on the right, you have climate change denial and evolution denial and things like that. So I'm with the left on that. So there's some things that the right would vehemently disagree with me on, and there's some things that the left would vehemently disagree with me on, and it's all related to science. I'm a science enthusiast, very much so.
Interesting. I've always had an interest in science myself. I always had an opinion of like there could be this kind of a government society that could be led by the scientific method and seeing how that would go. This was in my early teenage years, which I would like form this opinion.
Mm-hmm. Sounds kind of like Plato's philosopher king.
Yeah, a little bit like that. Yeah. So there was a little bit more of I would say, a lefty narrative of that, where I would say that society, we're all in this together, and we can push society together in a certain direction, and we can all devise a way to put all our best minds on focusing on the problems of energy, and we'll work on that together. Then the environment, then this, and if we just gradually just solve one problem at a time, we cure cancer, then we'll create a utopian society for ourselves. And then just time progressed, and then I think I've taken myself down the route of libertarianism. I just hear a lot of the arguments where it comes to the economy. When we start to give benefits to people, sometimes that has a reverse effect.
Oh, for sure.
Sometimes you give a drug dealer, so somebody who's addicted to drugs, help, sometimes that's the worst thing to do to them. So then there's this to and fro in society. And then as soon as you start to understand that the government has an incredible amounts of power to just change society in itself, as you start to put in support structures, as you start to remove structures away, society starts to go into some very strange little occurrences. We're like humans are like water, we'll just trickle down the way that sometimes that society is structured. So whatever the flume is designed to go in, we'll just angle ourselves one side to the other. But if it leans to one side too much, then some very strange occurrences happen.
Hmm.
So I try to say that the minimalist approach to government, the smallest government possible, is potentially the key factor of where to go. Now, you could say that there's some counter arguments to that, whereby there's elites and there's powers, and where the game is set that there's lots of people with lots of possessions and lots of assets, and it's a very difficult game to play up against these characters in society. However, I would say that potentially once you take away a lot of the lobbyists and all the other positions of power, it makes things a lot harder for these people that are accumulating assets and using leverage to purchase more to do over the small people in society. So this is an angle that I've been taking for some time. And then I've been investigating the blockchain technology and where that can take us. Then there's this little bit more of a leaning now where I start to say that we can have a society where there could be not just one currency, but multiple currencies. And there's ways in which you can manipulate these hard coded currencies to have little things that the government does inside them.
Hmm.
So, for example, you could have a currency which not only is a transaction of value between us both, but also will collect our garbage at the same time.
Huh.
It sounds a little bit fanciful, but as time progresses, people have all these different ways of transacting with each other with multitudes of currencies. And then potentially, we might not even have the requirement of government itself.
I would say it's definitely intellectually healthy to entertain some of these ideas, even if they do sound far fetched at first.
Yeah,
It's a good mental exercise.
I think actually most people that have come back to me just say it is interesting, it's good stuff to just look into it. So, going back to you, Nathan, where would you see America is right now? And are you optimistic or are you pessimistic?
Politically, we're in the middle of what Thomas Frank called the backlash culture. It's a culture of people who are reacting to things and they don't understand why they're reacting to it. They just know that they think they're supposed to react strongly and oppositionally to some of the things they perceive are going on.
Right.
The debates over abortion, stem cell research, GMOs, climate change, regulation. There's a culture of people, the Fox News viewers, the people who disparage experts, who have a backlash against knowledge-based and evidence-based approaches
Yeah.
to life. And that's the most worrying thing that's happening in politics, in my opinion.
Would you say that this is going to take us down a slippery slope? You can see straight away Donald Trump's come onto the scene. So the moderates of political positions are starting to slowly disappear, and now we're getting the extremists coming into power. They've got more of a sway. We've got the extremist journalists which are coming to sway. So does this put some dark clouds over America as we speak, or would you say that there's still some glimmers of sunshine when it comes to the journalists that still currently stand in America?
There's some hope that the situation will get better, that a lot of people are showing an interest in science, and that's a good starting point. Science communication is a challenge because a lot of scientists don't interact with the public, a lot of intellectuals don't interact with the public. There's a disconnect between the intellectual and the public that's pretty worrying. But I think a lot of people are doing a lot of good work. A lot of journalists are doing a lot of good work in bringing good information to the public. They're few and far between, but they're out there. And there's no reason to be 100% cynical and pessimistic. But you look at the rise of Donald Trump and you realize he is the embodiment of the American public in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And he is what a lot of Americans want because he ostensibly speaks it like it is, which is one of his favorite campaign slogans.
Yeah.
But speaking it like it is not the same as speaking it like the evidence shows it, reacting instantly to either something you perceive is going on or what you want other people to hear or what you know other people want to hear.
That's right. Absolutely. And there's something in me that says that I prefer this new style of politics in a weird way. Maybe it's just entertaining me. Maybe I'm just totally wrong, and maybe politicians should be very more scientific based and try and take a higher road sometimes. But I feel like obviously there's a connection, isn't there? When somebody offers an opinion and they go, there's no jobs around here. I don't know who's doing well around here, but there's no jobs. I don't know what stats you're bringing out there right now, but it's a load of bullshit to me. It resonates with people, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does for sure.
I think maybe it's a new wave of politics which is going to come into power now because everyone's seeing that Donald Trump has just come into power with literally just it's side sweep all the politicians as we look. I know that obviously Donald Trump isn't looking too great right now when it comes to the recent debate with Hillary Clinton. But
Hmm.
even so, he has sidesweeps a lot of politicians. He's sidesweeps a lot of journalists as well. Journalists are trying to really go hard at him to try and to prove that he's wrong and bring out loads of data and whatever information they can provide on him. But it's every time that they try and throw dirt at him, he seems to be getting stronger. So it's like this weird situation now where journalists are inept to actually knock people down. Now, I don't know really whether a journalist should be that kind of person that starts to slay people and choose and decide who should be part of this the celebrity culture and who shouldn't be, but it's an interesting state of affairs where you get politicians having more power than journalists. Now, when I say that, obviously there's a little feeling inside which goes, this sounds a bit dangerous to me." But even so, it's does excite me at the same time. I don't know.
No, it sounds like you're getting at something. The idea that people like Trump get stronger in the polls the more dirt is slung at them. Trump supporters view attacks on Trump, even if they're backed by evidence, as confirmation that he's, a righteous warrior being persecuted by the liberal elite.
Yeah,
That's the narrative that's out there.
yeah,
There's a conspiracy narrative that's out there for every single kind of scientific, evidence based debunking of nonsense. The purveyors of that nonsense, whether it be creationism or climate change denial or what have you, when presented with refutations or critiques, they point to the liberal media or the liberal elite, rather, and say they have an agenda, they're persecuting us. That conspiracy theory narrative is what allows a lot of purveyors of pseudoscience and dangerous politics to keep on being popular with the people who adhere to them.
that's true. You know, when you watch a sports game and you've got the underdog versus the giant, everyone starts to naturally goes to the underdog. And Donald Trump, obviously, I know he's a big power celebrity in America and almost around the globe now. He has come into the political fray as this underdog because he's not been in politics for a long time and he's going up against seasoned politicians. He looks like he's trying to be natural. Like, I don't know whether it
Mm-hmm.
is all natural, but he's trying to appear like a blue collared worker kind of thing. Obviously, he's a multi
Yeah,
billionaire, but he's trying to appear like some guy that's been working on the factory floor all his years, and he's trying to say, "Look, this is enough's enough. I'm not having our jobs go to China anymore." And how much that resonates with people is just immense.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there.
It's pretty much Bruce Springsteen, isn't it? Just like going, right, this is
Yes.
enough. So I still take a position. What about this one thought for you? I mean, this is crazy, but when it comes to looking at these situations with Donald Trump, I take a conspiracy theory in my mind straight away, and I say to myself, what if Donald Trump was put into power just to be the perfect winner in the world? Just this is not anything that I've read, but I'm just thinking this aloud.
Hmm.
He is almost the perfect person that you could put into this position right now, isn't he? He's like a celebrity. He's a big celebrity. He can shoot people down with his mouth. I know it's conspiratorial, but you could say that in some ways he is the perfect person to put in a position if you did have a power elite in place.
Yeah, that could be. I think a lot of Republicans are wringing their hands over their decision to put him up as their nominee. So there's that side to it as well. A lot of Republicans consider him an embarrassment to their party,
That's true, yeah.
but a lot of other Republicans are attracted to him for the reasons you mentioned, that he ostensibly represents the common blue collar everyday man.
The main thing I always say, I was probably just getting at, is that let's just assume for a second here that there's a controlled elite.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now everyone says that everyone's donor backed. Okay, so if Obama gets into power, there's sponsors which come into power. You've got all the Wall Street elites which are putting in all this money and funding, and that gets them in power. That puts out all the advertised banners, and that gets the party funded. Now, this system isn't working anymore, really, because I think everyone's pretty much well clued up on it. Now,
Yeah.
if you would say that there is a different way of doing it nowadays, it would be to get somebody like Donald Trump in, because then there's no way that anybody could potentially believe that he was being sponsored by anybody else. Now, I know this is a conspiracy theory. This is just a conspiracy theory off the top of my head anyway, but I just like to entertain these ideas just for the fact that it's never too much of a harm to think this way, potentially just because he might not have just a pure narrative of just being a man for the people, just saying, okay, well, I'm a rich, powerful guy. Now here's my time to give back to society. That's just one theory of mine. Now there's another theory. Obviously, this is probably the most plausible theory here.
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump is a very rich man, and what every rich man wants is power, because that's something that they can never quite obtain. Now that they can lobby people and they can get politicians to do what they want in some ways, but there's only certain limitations to doing that. And every man that is rich would like more power, so therefore he's trying to get that crown. He wants to be king. The rich man wants to be king, and this is the position that he wants to take. Now, this is probably the most plausible position, but I always try and take one step further and think, okay, but there could be something even sinister behind that as well on top of it. Where would you say that thinking is? Do you think that's a bad way of thinking, or do you think that's to be conspiratorial of positions of power is okay?
Oh, I think it's definitely healthy to be skeptical of powerful institutions and corporations. I think that's completely legitimate.
Yeah,
I would say that's healthy, provided that you don't go down the route of preaching it as a mantra or doing what a lot of activists do and kind of eschew evidence based thinking about it.
yeah. I think this is the problem that sometimes these things can get you in, is that I could say to myself, okay, well, let's just say, for example, Donald Trump is ruled by the elite. I'm going to try and find all the supporting evidence that proves my claim is true.
Mhm.
And this is a problem, isn't it? Sometimes I could go all the way out there and I could say, okay, well, Donald Trump has done this business dealing with the Rothschild on this year, so we've got this problem now. So I think they're connected. Trump has done this business deal with Putin and make him in the pocket of that man. That's a dangerous thing to do.
It's very easy to find confirmatory instances for any hypothesis you have.
Yeah.
What's hard is to attempt to falsify your own hypothesis, which is what scientists do.
Yeah.
In one of the earliest experiments ever conducted on confirmation bias in the 1950s, I believe his name was Peter Wason. He gave participants in the study a series of numbers, 2, 4, 6,
Yeah.
and increasing by 2 every time. And he asked the participants, figure out what rule this pattern of numbers is following. And once you think you've figured it out, you can write down and tell me, and we'll see if you're right.
Yeah.
So most people in that study, the vast majority of them said, well, the rule is even numbers advancing by 2 every time.
Yeah.
And the participants were able to ask questions of the researcher to confirm their suspicions or their thoughts about what the pattern was. And
Yeah.
they said, so 8, 10, 12, does that follow the rule? The researcher would say, yes, it does. After a few repetitions of this, the participants would say, okay, that's the rule, even numbers advancing by 2,
Yeah.
which wasn't actually the case. The actual rule was any 3 numbers in succession. If they had asked any other questions besides the ones they were using to confirm what they thought was going on, they would have falsified their original hypothesis that it was even numbers advancing by two.
I don't see there's too many harms in it until it starts to become that it's your crusade and you need to push out this false narrative after a while. It's like us two are playing chess, right? And I'm looking at all your different moves. Each move that you potentially could take is my conspiracy theory. This is my conspiracy of how you're going to take out my king.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's no harm in me thinking about all of your available options and then just keeping that into the back of my head. But as the evidence goes on and as you play certain moves, I start to disqualify that you're going to do that certain move. And then I say, okay, well, now I can definitely see by your actions, this is your motive. And then we start to go down that line and I can gather more information about that. I can put out a billion different conspiracy theories, but then seeing somebody's actions and then aligning the actions with the evidence and the conspiracy theory, then that's potentially the way forward where people should guide themselves and maybe where journalists should guide themselves as well.
Oh, for sure. Mm-hmm.
We seem to be in the world of conspiracy theory. It's everywhere nowadays.
I find conspiracy theories fascinating personally as a window into the psyche of people.
Yes.
They're pattern seeking tendencies that we all have as social primates trying to survive on the savannas of Africa, making type 2 errors, type 1 errors. Is that a line in the grass? All I see is a rustle. I don't know, so I'm going to assume it's a line in the grass.
Yeah.
That served us well in our early evolution. Nowadays, there are remnants of that we still hold on to as relatively recently evolved species who's only been around for about 150,000 years now.
Yeah.
Modern humans. So we still have the remnants of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, and that manifests itself in conspiracy theories. We want a simple answer to things. We see things going on in the political world globally that baffle us and confuse us. And we want a simple narrative that we can easily understand. And that simple narrative often is something like, well, the Illuminati is trying to control us. There's a power elite that is in league with the devil, and they want to implant us with microchips and turn us into slaves and turn the planet into a prison. Stuff like that.
It makes a good Hollywood movie anyway, doesn't it?
It does.
Nathan, I'll actually have to explain how I found you in the first place because I actually put out a podcast myself about the Zeitgeist movement and I made a certain number of critiques of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you've done that yourself. Instantly from doing that, I got a couple of people that came back on the comments board and was telling me that I didn't quite understand what the Zeitgeist movement was and I didn't know the difference between the project as Avalon and the Zeitgeist movement. They were just suggesting that I read up more. I think I asked him if he wanted to come on, so we could discuss further, but I don't think it never manifested it anyway. But I just found it interesting how you went into a very long position with the Zeitgeist movement. I don't know if you could just break it down for us.
The Zeitgeist movement was founded by Peter Joseph. It was spawned by the film that he made called Zeitgeist. And the movement is about promoting social change in society. One of their biggest goals is to transform society into a resource-based economy, to abolish free-floating fiat currency,
Yeah.
and return to something similar to the gold standard, at least in principle, which would be, again, the resource-based economy. They want transparency in governments, which is a legitimate desire. But the way they go about their goals, for one thing, they don't do much. They have coffee house meetings and parlor meetings, but they don't do much activism. Their leader, Peter Joseph, has become essentially an internet cult figure. It all revolves around him. He doesn't allow dissent. He will, on his forums, he will block people who disagree with him. He'll block people who agree with him on those things, but challenge him on a few points. He does not curb dissent in any way whatsoever.
He remarkably looks like a V for Vendetta as well.
What was that?
V for Vendetta. Have you seen the movie?
Oh, I have seen that.
Yeah,
yes.
the Guy Fawkes sort of looking guy, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which is always part of the anonymous movement a lot as well.
Yeah, yeah.
I actually try to go into a little bit more about the economic side of things as well with the Zeitgeist movement and how that thing could be ran. But then I started to pick apart a little bit more so on the side of how society was structured and how relationships are get formed. Because if we come into a society where everything is available, everything's free, that starts to screw up the family, that does start to screw up relationships. Because when it comes to a marriage, there is contractual agreement whereby a man and a woman are going to provide a certain level of resources for their children. They're going to stick to it. Obviously, everyone knows like the mantra of the man is the provider, the woman is the caregiver at home, and things like that. But that's the old traditional way. But as time progresses, that slightly evolved a bit. But as soon as you have a resource-based economy where everything is ready for you, that starts to attack the family in a certain way.
Yeah, and it's implausible in a number of other ways too. It doesn't take into account certain financial realities, how money works.
Yes, the role of price in a market is essential because that price point is the way that you understand when there's shortages of goods and then there's abundances of supply as well.
Yeah, I mean, governments can't get a handle on how much money is in circulation based on what they have at the moment. All their estimates are a year ahead.
Yeah,
They don't actually base any of their monetary principles or regulations or laws or any of that on what's currently in circulation. Because what's currently in circulation, they already accounted for the previous year. And that's one reason the fiat money system has worked so well so far. There are some problems with it, but it's probably the best that we've come up with so far. It's hard to see how a resource based economy would work. Maybe in the future, maybe when certain social realities are have evolved and are a little bit different, but I don't see the Zeitgeist movement's goals being feasible for a long time to come.
the best argument that I hear from the Zeitgeist movement is the environmental one. So if you could say that it's easy to perceive that the Earth's resources are finite, humans are expanding all the time. Eventually, we're going to reach a point where the resources are going to run out, or going to be depleted, or going to be used to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
And in the act of self defense of humanity, a movement like a resource based economy is the only way that we can approach how we structure society to save ourselves.
Yeah, that could be. And I would say regulations play an important role as well. There needs to be a balance between individual freedom and social safety. And the externalizing of costs to society that comes as a result of granting people with a certain level of influence a level of freedom that your average people wouldn't be able to enjoy. That creates problems with externalizing costs.
Sure. It's a compelling movie. I understand that there's a lot of areas where a lot of the things that they put out in the movies have been debunked. I haven't really gone over every single one. Maybe you can provide a little bit more clarity on that.
On which issue?
The religion side, the same narrative of Jesus is this thing that goes throughout history that gets repeated and repeated to the people, but all it is a mechanism of power. Now, I understand religion has formed to some extent as a form of power and a power structure. Maybe not necessarily as this repetition that's happened throughout time, and the only sole narrative of religion is to assume power on the people.
Exactly. There are a lot of other functions of religion in addition to that. The Zeitgeist movie has a few things right about religion. The movie is correct in stating that the Gospels, for example, are mostly fiction and fable, but the movie gets the mythology wrong. It traces the mythology to the wrong mythical stories and figures and cultures. For example, saying that Christianity is identical to certain religions in ancient Egypt is factually incorrect. Saying that the same exact story has been told over and over again, there are similarities, but they're not facsimiles. They're not exactly the same. And it doesn't point to a power structure. It just points to different cultures throughout history, ancient and modern, finding appealing certain notions about, for example, resurrection from the dead, life after death, dying and rising gods. These are concepts that many cultures came up with independently of each other because they speak to certain human needs that are universal.
Yeah, the movies convey that throughout your life, throughout your time, you have been a slave. We've been controlled. Society is basically the worst design possible for mankind, and literally anything will do that'll be better than what we have right now. Now, that's probably where my problem lies with that movie. Would you say that's your side as well?
Yeah, I think that's an oversimplification of certain social realities. The way society is structured, for one thing, it's not all the same worldwide. And for another thing, it's in a lot of ways an organic evolution, the way societies build themselves up. A lot of times there is a plan, but a lot of historical contingencies contribute to the form and the shape that society ends up taking. There's not necessarily a conspiracy to control us, and it's not endemic in the way society is structured. It's just that people who are in power have what's called mutual shared interests. So they're not conspiring with each other to control us. They just have mutual interests that work together, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in tandem. But there's a lot of things that happen organically and not by design.
Yeah, well, throughout time, obviously, there's been power structures. It was always like we become tribal, then there's a lack of resources, so we form bigger communities, and then there's kings, there's warriors, there's all these things. There's a lot of warring that goes throughout our time, and then eventually there's structures which get built and they become bigger and bigger. And then at the same time, we start to have a more of a developed brain. It's no longer like the lizard brain, the underside of the brain, but it's more the conscious brain, which is starting to happen at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And we start to have a little bit more of a theory about how society should be run and have an overview of what should work. And I say that this is probably like some kind of evolution over time. We've had all the lizard structures of society be created, whereby when I say the lizard, I mean the brain, the lizard brain
Yeah,
sort of thing.
not the David Icke.
Yeah, that society gets built, and then potentially there's like this, it's an evolution. Maybe what we're seeing right now in society is just basically a direct connection to what's happening with our brains itself. We're evolving, and it just takes a little bit of time and maybe a lot of things in society that have been put in place are for very, very good reasons, and you shouldn't ever take them away, like freedom of speech. Never be tempered or played around with. But when it comes to some things in society, it's definitely very valid to question it. Why do we have all these power structures in place, and why does the police have this incredible amount of power over us and citizens have none? And it's always good to question that position, because where we've come from on our trajectory has been potentially this hunter-gatherer that has had to look after its resources and push itself into certain territories which it's never liked to be put in before, and manifests ourselves into this position where we've always got to be wary, we've always got to look over our shoulder, we've got to always keep our resources, keep our tribe protected. But then at a certain stage where we've evolved, there may be a point in which we can evolve into something better, and our society can be structured into something better as well. And that's probably where I position myself as a bit of an optimist.
Yeah, I think I would fall in line with that line of thought as well. That we're in transition. The reptilian part of our brains is still influencing our thoughts about the people who are in power. And we're analogous to the rustling in the grass. We think it's a lion, we think it's a predator. It might not be. We are reaching the point where we need to not just yell predator and run away. We actually need to arm ourselves with skepticism and critical thinking and investigate the rustling grass.
It's very easy to label things. You could label, okay, well, this society's bad, this society's just been set up to make me fail, but it's far more complicated than that. There's a history. We always think in terms of what's happening nowadays, present form, and what's happening to me right now. But the history tells a totally different story. And some of it's for very valid reasons. Some of it's for power reasons. Some of it's where some people are at the top. A lot of people like to do very little for a lot in return. It's all human nature, psychology. There's a big pool of information which has led us to this point, and to label it is the danger. I guess that's where good theories and investigation leads us to a place which can evolve us into something new.
Absolutely.
So, thank you very much for that, Nathan. If anybody would like to look into more of the information that you're putting out there, the skeptical inquests, what was the address?
There are two addresses. You can find me at nathandickey.wordpress.com is the main one. And the other one is a website hosted by the Trolling with Logic podcast that I'm on. And you can find that as a slightly different format, slightly more readable, I think. That's trollingwithlogic.com/skeptical-inquests.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, just for the listeners out there, when you approach Nathan's blogs, don't get like taken away with the size that you write. It's you got to just like sort of say, right, okay, I'm going to sit down here. I'm gonna read this for about an hour now. It might take me a bit of time, but Nathan will take you on a little bit of a journey with him, and it's good to go through those kind of things, I think.
Yeah, some are long, some are short and readable. I'm actually trying to make it more of a readable blog and make, shorter posts that are more digestible for someone who doesn't have time to sit and read for a long time.
That's fair enough.
The long essays I write are in a lot of ways serve the function of references, so you can reference back to something I wrote if you have
I noticed that, yeah.
a question
Yeah.
about a certain aspect of something.
Yeah, it's great stuff. Yeah, well, have you got any future plans? Are you going to push yourself in more into a journalist direction, or are you going to keep on with your blogging?
I'll probably keep on blogging for as long as I can. I'm hoping to pursue a career in journalism. I've studied it, but I don't yet get paid for it. But I'd like to go in that direction as a career, hopefully in the near future.
And you're going to put your neck on the line a few times, are you?
I hope so, yeah.
Oh, good stuff, Nathan. All right, well, yeah, it's been a pleasure, and thank you very much for coming onto the show. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It was fun.